History loves to romanticize great leaders, but few have shaped the world like Octavian Augustus. If you think he simply inherited a fully formed Roman Empire and ruled it without difficulty, you're mistaken. He wasn't born an emperor, he became one, and his rise was marked by betrayals, epic battles, political intrigues, and a strategic acumen that would make any master manipulator look like an amateur. Imagine a slight 18-year-old kid, underestimated by everyone, thrown into the middle of the greatest political whirlwind of his time. His great-uncle, Julius Caesar, had just been assassinated. Rome was plunged into chaos, and no one cared. But he had something the others didn't: patience, cool-headedness, and an unyielding instinct for power. Every move he made was meticulously calculated, every alliance forged at the perfect moment, and every enemy eliminated with surgical precision. The result? He dismantled the Republic before anyone even noticed, built an empire that would last over 400 years, and became the first and most influential emperor in Roman history. His name went from Gaius Octavian to Octavian Augustus, and his story is a veritable manual on how to conquer, consolidate, and hold on to power. If you think ruling is all about armies and battles, just wait until you see how Augustus's razor-sharp mind manipulated senators, generals, and even public opinion. But his journey wasn't easy. He faced formidable rivals, survived betrayals, won battles that seemed impossible, and left a legacy that still echoes today. Rome deified him after his death, but the truth is, he was already a legend in his lifetime. And now, you're about to discover the path of the man who redefined history. Get ready, because this isn't just a biography, it's a lesson in ambition, strategy, and what it really means to lead. March 15th, 44 BC was marked by an unprecedented act of treachery. Julius Caesar, the man who ruled Rome, fell to the blades of senators who feared his growing power. The Senate, which once governed the Republic with an iron fist, saw Caesar's absolute authority as a threat to tradition. Yet ironically, by eliminating him, they paved the way for something even grander, the Roman Empire, which would be shaped by none other than his heir, Octavian Augustus. Fate sure works in mysterious ways, doesn't it? Caesar's will revealed. A surprise for many. His legal heir wasn't one of the veteran generals or influential politicians, but his young great-nephew, Gaius Octavian. Imagine a kid of just 18, frail and lacking any military experience, being thrown into the most treacherous political arena in history. It looked like a lost cause, but as we know, appearances can be deceiving. Octavian possessed something few noticed: a razor-sharp intellect, strategic patience, and an innate hunger for power. Rome was thrown into turmoil by Caesar's assassination. The people who adored their leader demanded revenge, while the senators tried to justify the act as a defense of the Republic. Amidst this chaos, Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest generals and allies, attempted to seize control. But he wasn't the only player on this board. The young Octavian wasted no time. Rather than acting on impulse, he quietly began gathering allies, building a base of support that would soon change the course of history. Octavian's strength lay in his unrivaled ability to play the political game. He knew how to sway the emotions of the masses, used Caesar's legacy to win over soldiers, and with well-chosen words, positioned himself as the true successor. When he convinced the Senate to grant him military power, it became clear he wasn't just a lucky young man. He was a natural strategist. And as Mark Antony began to make his move, another name entered the equation: Lepidus. From that moment on, Rome wouldn't have just one leader vying for power, it would have three. Thus was born the Second Triumvirate, a fragile alliance teeming with hidden agendas. On one side was Mark Antony, an experienced and ambitious warrior. On the other, Lepidus, an influential politician. In between stood Octavian, who would gradually learn to turn allies into disposable pawns. The fate of the Republic was sealed, but no one could have predicted how this young man, underestimated by many, would use this temporary alliance to pave his way to the top. And when the dust finally settled, only one name would be etched into eternity: Augustus. Rome was on fire, not literally, but politically. After Caesar's assassination, chaos gripped the city, and the Republic seemed on the verge of collapse. It was in this environment that the Second Triumvirate emerged, an alliance between Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, joining forces to hunt down Caesar's assassins and stabilize the Roman Empire. But if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that political alliances are like sandcastles, impressive at first glance, but fragile under pressure. The Triumvirate quickly proved to be both efficient and brutal. To consolidate their power, they launched a series of proscriptions, lists of political enemies condemned to death, seizing their wealth and eliminating any opposition. Among the victims was Cicero, one of Rome's greatest orators, who dared to oppose Mark Antony. The irony? Octavian, who had initially supported Cicero, did nothing to save him. It was a stark reminder that this young heir to Caesar wasn't merely ambitious. He knew how to play the power game without hesitation. With Caesar's assassins defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 B.C., the Triumvirate was supposed to bring stability to Rome. But as expected, three leaders with inflated egos weren't going to share power for long. Lepidus, the least influential of the trio, was quickly sidelined, leaving only two titans, Mark Antony and Octavian. And if a showdown between them was inevitable, the spark for the conflict wouldn't come from battles or fiery speeches, but from something much more personal: a woman. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, entered the chessboard of Roman politics alongside Mark Antony, and that turned out to be a fatal mistake. While Octavian was busy cementing his reputation as the defender of Rome's traditional values, Mark Antony increasingly appeared out of touch, ensnared in a life of luxury and excess with Cleopatra. The final blow came when he divorced Octavian's sister, a slight that would not go unanswered. Rome didn't tolerate leaders who let their hearts rule, and Octavian knew how to turn his rival's weakness into his greatest weapon. Thus, the clash between the two became inevitable. On one side was Octavian, the calculating young man who knew how to manipulate public opinion and consolidate his power with cunning. On the other, Mark Antony, the battle-hardened general who was beginning to look like a foreigner in the eyes of the Romans. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the Republic and the birth of a new empire, but the battle that would define it all was still to come. The tension between Octavian and Mark Antony reached its peak when rumors began to spread throughout Rome. Antony, swayed by Cleopatra, was more interested in Egypt than in the Republic. Octavian masterfully exploited this narrative, presenting himself as the true guardian of Roman values. Both the people and the Senate began to view Antony with suspicion. After all, since when does a Roman general trade Rome for a foreign queen? Politics, as always, is a game of perception, and Octavian was winning. But Antony wasn't just any opponent. He was a seasoned veteran, one of Caesar's closest comrades, and a charismatic leader. To counter him, Octavian needed more than stirring speeches and political maneuvering. He needed a legitimate reason to eliminate his rival. That's when he pulled off a brilliant move. He publicized a supposed will from Mark Antony, in which Antony declared his intention to bequeath Roman lands to Cleopatra and her children. Whether it was true or not didn't really matter. The damage was done. The Senate declared war, but not against Mark Antony. It was against Cleopatra. This was genius, as it transformed the conflict into a battle between Rome and a foreign threat rather than a mere internal dispute. Octavian knew the Romans would, never accept being governed by a man who put Egypt above the Republic. And so, the game was set. Rome versus Cleopatra, Octavian versus Mark Antony, and as expected, the decisive battle was not far off. Antony's situation worsened as his reputation crumbled. Rather than bolstering him, Cleopatra came to be seen as his Achilles heel. Octavian, on the other hand, was emerging as a symbol of order and stability. His propaganda was so effective that even Antony's allies began to desert him. Rome had already chosen its future leader. It was now just a matter of formalizing that decision on the battlefield. And that decision would soon come over the Mediterranean in one of history's most famous naval battles. Rome's fate now rested on the outcome of an inevitable showdown. On one side was Mark Antony's military experience. He still had loyal troops and a track record of victories. On the other, Octavian's strategic mind, which knew how to turn even the smallest detail into an advantage. The resolution of this conflict was about to be decided in the waters near Actium, and when the dust settled, the world would know the name of the man who would shape the Roman Empire forever. Rome's destiny was decided at sea. In 31 BC, the forces of Octavian and Mark Antony clashed at the Battle of Actium, one of the greatest naval engagements of antiquity. Antony, alongside Cleopatra, relied on his fleet to change the tide, but Octavian, ever the cool, calculating strategist, had already secured his advantage before the fight even began. His navy, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Agrippa, cut off the enemy's supply routes, leaving Antony's soldiers starving and demoralized even before the first arrow was loosed. When the battle began, it was clear that Octavian was one step ahead. His ships were smaller and more nimble, while Antony's vessels, larger and heavier, struggled to maneuver. The combat quickly turned into a massacre. But the most devastating blow didn't come from catapults or swords. It came from an unexpected decision by Cleopatra. Amid the chaos, her fleet suddenly retreated and fled the battlefield. Antony, upon seeing his queen depart, abandoned his men and followed her. It was the beginning of the end. Imagine the psychological impact of that moment. Antony's already weakened army watched their commander flee, completely losing the will to fight. What remained of his fleet was decimated by Octavian, and within mere hours, the battle that was meant to decide the Republic's future was virtually over. The victory was overwhelming. For Rome, it confirmed that Mark Antony was no longer a leader but a man adrift, overwhelmed by his passion for Cleopatra. For Octavian, it was the final step towards cementing his absolute control. The defeat at Actium crushed any hope of resistance. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, but they knew the noose was tightening. Octavian, relentless as ever, marched on. Alexandria, determined to wipe out any remaining threats. In despair, Antony took his own life after mistakenly believing that Cleopatra had already died, a false piece of information that sealed his fate. Shortly after, Cleopatra, realizing she would be taken prisoner to Rome, also ended her life, allegedly by allowing a venomous snake to bite her. With the fall of Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian no longer had any rivals. Rome was his. The Senate and the people, weary of endless wars and instability, were ready to embrace his leadership. But instead of simply crowning himself king, he acted shrewdly. He maintained the facade, consolidated his power, and soon after, the world would witness the birth of a new era. An era in which the Roman Empire would cease to be just an ambition and would become a reality under one name: Augustus. Octavian didn't need crowns or extravagant titles to rule Rome. He only needed the consent of the Senate and the people. And that's exactly what he achieved. In 27 BC, after years of civil strife and instability, he announced that he would return his extraordinary powers to the Senate in a theatrical gesture of humility. But those who fell for it didn't understand the game. The Senate, grateful for the generosity of the young leader who had restored order, did exactly as he wanted. They granted him even more authority and the title of Augustus. Thus, without shedding another drop of blood, Octavian became the first Roman emperor. The great secret of Augustus was his ability to keep up the illusion that the Republic still existed. On paper, the Senate continued to function, magistrates were still elected, and Rome was still free. In reality, everything ran through him. He commanded the army, controlled the most strategic provinces, and his word carried more weight than any written law. It was absolute power, all wrapped up in the guise of republican tradition, a true master of political manipulation. And if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that people will accept any regime as long as they feel they're getting something in return. And Augustus delivered exactly that. Under his leadership, Rome flourished. He implemented administrative reforms, strengthened the economy, and began constructing monuments that still inspire awe today. The city transformed from a jumble of brick buildings into the magnificent capital of an empire. As he himself declared, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." But ruling wasn't just about building temples or organizing the Senate. It was about maintaining control. Augustus knew his authority depended on the support of the legions, so he reformed the army, ensuring steady paychecks and land for veteran soldiers. He also established the Praetorian Guard, an elite force whose loyalty was solely to him. With that in place, any threat to his rule could be crushed before it even had a chance to fester. Security, stability, and order, three pillars that upheld his reign. Thus Rome transformed from a turbulent republic into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But greatness always comes with its challenges, and fate was about to test Augustus's strength. For all the peace he had secured within Rome, the empire's frontiers were another story altogether, and one of those borders would soon become the stage for one of the worst defeats in Roman history. With Augustus at the helm, Rome finally achieved what had seemed impossible for centuries: stability. His rule ushered in the Pax Romana, a period of peace and prosperity that would last for over 2 centuries. But don't be fooled. This peace didn't mean an absence of conflict. It meant absolute control over internal and external tensions. Augustus understood that a strong Roman Empire needed more than just legions. It needed structure, efficient administration, and of course, a contented populace. The first major change came in the way the provinces were governed. Previously, governors were often corrupt, exploiting their territories for personal gain. Augustus put his house in order by creating a system of direct administration and appointing only trusted men to key positions. As a result, the provinces began to prosper, and taxes, which once fattened the pockets of greedy senators, were now used to strengthen the empire itself. And when people feel they're getting something in return, the likelihood of revolts drops dramatically. But the reforms didn't stop there. Augustus knew that Rome needed infrastructure to support its growth. So he invested in building roads, aqueducts, and public buildings, transforming the city and making communication between territories a breeze. The famous saying, "All roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a poetic notion. It was a reality built brick by brick during his reign. And let's face it, for an empire that needed to move armies and resources efficiently, well-planned roads were absolutely essential. Another crucial aspect was the army. Augustus not only strengthened the legions, but also instilled discipline and stability among the soldiers. In the past, any ambitious general could promise riches to his troops and march against Rome. With the new military structure, soldiers began to receive direct payments from the state, along with guaranteed pensions. This move eliminated the power of independent generals and ensured that soldiers' loyalty was solely to the emperor. Simple, efficient, and downright brilliant. With solid reforms and a rejuvenated city, Augustus had cemented his legacy as Rome's greatest leader. Yet, as undeniable as his political genius was, even he couldn't foresee all the challenges that lay ahead. One such challenge wasn't coming from within the empire, but from the wild lands up north, where one of the worst defeats in Roman history was about to occur. Even Augustus, the man who transformed Rome into an unbreakable empire, was not immune to the whims of fate. In 9 AD, an unprecedented disaster shook the Roman Empire and tarnished the luster of the Pax Romana. 3 entire legions, led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, marched confidently into the dense forests of Germania. What they didn't know was that they were walking straight into a deadly trap, where their discipline and training would be rendered useless against an enemy who knew the terrain better than anyone. The mastermind behind the ambush was Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who, ironically, had been trained by the Romans themselves. He knew every weakness of the Roman army and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The legions, used to fighting in open formations, were forced to navigate narrow, winding paths. When the storm of arrows and spears began, the Romans had nowhere to run. The forest turned into a natural graveyard, and the pride of the Roman Empire was shattered before it even had a chance to retaliate. The impact of this disaster was enormous. Rome, accustomed to crushing victories, now saw its legions annihilated. In one fell swoop, it's said that when Augustus received the news, he was so devastated that he spent months muttering, "Varus, return my legions to me." It was a deep shock for an empire that had always seemed invincible. For the first time, the idea that Rome couldn't conquer everything began to seep into the minds of both the people and its generals. And the consequences weren't merely psychological. After the defeat, Rome abandoned any serious attempt to conquer Germania. The empire's borders were redefined along the Rhine River, establishing a frontier that would endure for centuries. This decision forever altered Europe's geopolitical landscape, as Germania was never Romanized like Gaul, Hispania, or Britannia. In the end, this battle wasn't just a defeat, it was a turning point that redefined the limits of the Roman Empire. But even in the face of this setback, Augustus didn't lose control. He bolstered defenses, reorganized the army, and ensured that Rome stood firm. Varus's tragedy served as a brutal reminder that the empire wasn't invincible, and as a testament to the resilience of its ruler. After all, despite all the hardships, Augustus remained in power until the very end. And his legacy wasn't just a consolidated empire, it was also a fascinating personality, full of nuances, contradictions, and a strategic brilliance that set him apart from all his predecessors. If there's one thing that distinguishes a great leader from an ordinary ruler, it's the ability to adapt to circumstances without losing control of the narrative. Augustus, better known as Octavian, Augustus embodied that skill. From a young age, he knew how to balance brutality with diplomacy, using each at just the right moment. In the early days, he was ruthless, hunting down enemies, eliminating rivals, and consolidating his power without hesitation. But over time, he refined his approach, emerging as a symbol of stability and wisdom. Those who saw the calm, calculating Augustus at the end of his life might never have imagined that, in the beginning, he was an ambitious young man willing to do anything to secure his place in the Roman Empire. One of Augustus's greatest strengths was his political savvy. He understood that a leader's image was as important as his actions. Unlike Julius Caesar, who paraded around like an uncrowned king, Augustus adopted the role of first among equals. He dressed modestly, shunned public extravagance, and consistently reinforced the idea that Rome was still a republic. It was a brilliant piece of theater because in reality, he wielded absolute control. Yet the people and the Senate loved the illusion that they still had a voice. And if history teaches us anything, It's that people are far more receptive to a new system when it masquerades as continuity. In addition to being a political strategist, Augustus was a master of propaganda. He commissioned artworks, statues, and poems that exalted his government, portraying him as a divine leader chosen to steer Rome toward greatness. Virgil, one of the greatest poets of his time, penned the Aeneid, a work that connected Rome's origins to Aeneas, a Trojan hero, and by extension, to Augustus's own lineage. It was the creation of a myth. He wasn't just a ruler, he was part of Rome's destiny. Controlling the army was crucial, but controlling the narrative was even more powerful. Despite his impeccable public image, Augustus also had an extremely pragmatic and at times ruthless side. He didn't hesitate to exile anyone who threatened his order, including, on one occasion, even his own daughter Julia, when her behavior became a public scandal. Upholding Roman morals and customs was essential to his vision of the empire, and he tolerated no deviations. At the same time, he knew exactly how to reward allies and keep the elite firmly in line. It was a constant balancing act where even the smallest misstep could prove fatal. And so, Octavian Augustus cemented his reputation not merely as an emperor, but as an architect of power. He wasn't just a man who ruled Rome. He was the man who defined what it truly meant to be a Roman emperor. But as brilliant as he was, even he couldn't escape fate. Time always wins, and the empire he built would eventually have to move on without him. Time exacts its toll, even on the greatest emperors. In 14 AD, after more than 4 decades at the helm of the Roman Empire, Augustus felt the weight of the years bearing down on him. His body was no longer what it once was, and politics, his favorite game, was beginning to wear him out. Yet unlike many rulers who leave power to chance, he meticulously planned his succession. His stepson and son-in-law, Tiberius, was groomed to take the throne, ensuring that the machine he had built would continue running. Augustus may have been mortal, but his legacy was meant to be eternal. It is said that his final private words were, "If I have played my part in the drama of life well, applaud me as I exit the stage," a phrase that perfectly sums up his rule. For the public, however, he left another message. "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." And he wasn't exaggerating. Under his administration, Rome transformed from an unstable, decaying city into the capital of the greatest empire in history. His reforms, roads, and constructions ensured that his influence would be felt for centuries. Yet more than the buildings, Augustus's true legacy lay in the power structure he created. The greatest testament to his genius was how he transformed a dying republic into an empire before anyone even realized it. His government laid the groundwork for imperial succession, something Julius Caesar never managed to do. It was this continuity that allowed Rome to flourish for over 400 years after his death. For many historians, Augustus wasn't just a great emperor. He became the blueprint for all who followed, and make no mistake, his impact wasn't confined to the Roman Empire. Even today, leaders and strategists study his administration, his ability to manipulate narratives, and his knack for turning crises into opportunities. He understood that power isn't maintained solely by the strength of arms, but by controlling perception. The very concept of Augustus, which began as a title, has come to be synonymous with greatness and authority, echoing through the centuries. When Augustus died, he wasn't merely remembered, he was deified. The Senate declared him a god, and temples were erected in his honor. But more than statues and shrines, his true monument was the Roman Empire itself, a realm that bore his mark in every conquered territory, every law established, and every ruler who emulated his model. The Republic was dead, and in its place, Something far greater was born. Yet now, without Augustus, the big question remained. Could Rome maintain its balance without the man who had shaped it? The story of Octavian Augustus isn't just about a young man who inherited the Roman Empire. It's about a strategist who knew how to build an immortal legacy. He understood that true power isn't merely in swords, but in the minds that wield them. He manipulated politics, controlled narratives, crushed rivals, and ultimately transformed Rome into an unbreakable empire. But here comes the big question. What if he hadn't won? What would the world look like today? If you look closely, the lessons of Augustus remain as vibrant as ever. Leadership, influence, strategy, and resilience are just as essential today as they were at the peak of the Roman Empire. He knew how to build an empire that lasted for centuries. What about you? What are you building that will outlast your time here? Are you playing the right game, or are you still caught up in petty battles? Augustus's legacy wasn't accidental. He learned to think long-term, while his enemies fixated on the immediate moment. He knew that whoever controls perception controls reality. And you? Are you simply reacting to circumstances, or are you shaping your own story? What can you learn from this emperor and apply to your life today? If you want to keep exploring stories like this and uncover the secrets of the great empires and leaders of the past, don't miss our upcoming content. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and come discover how history can teach us more about the future than any modern book ever could. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but the lessons of Augustus still stand tall.